There are places in these mountains where the road gets easy, and that's when a man ought to be most afraid. Have you ever topped a rise that felt a little too smooth, or come up a trail where nothing crossed your path? No deer, no jay, no wind in the leaves, and known, without a reason you could put into words, that you were being allowed to pass. That's how country like this acts when it is making up its mind. Before I begin, tell me where you are tonight. Just the town, the county, whatever you call the ground beneath your feet. Leave it down there. It matters to me to know where these stories go when the light is off and the room is quiet and the tale is telling itself in your ear. Now, a word before this one starts in earnest. If the kind of case I tell here is the sort you'd want more of, not just one but 10, each told in full in a voice made for the dark, there is a collection. What the Mountain Keeps. 10 files from 10 counties, 5 states, 1893 to 1955. Every one of them walked up into easy-looking ground, and every one signed off by the law with the wrong word. 10 hours to sit within the dark, start to finish. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Now then, I want to tell you about a case out of the Blue Ridge. A case that has 3 dates on it. 1843 when it began, 1893 when it was found, and 1955 when the last man who could speak on the record about it signed a letter refusing to say another word. Between those dates are the 62 people this story concerns, and one round, low well cut into the side of a valley in a county in western North Carolina on a piece of ground that is not, and has never been, drawn onto any public map. That is where we start. The fall of 1893 came late to the Blue Ridge. The maples along the North Carolina line held their green through most of October, and the frosts, when they came at odd hours, and did not stay. It was into that unfinished autumn that the Norfolk and Western Railway sent a surveyor by the name of Ambrose Renner, 47 years old, tall and narrow through the shoulders, with a face burned brown along the cheekbones and pale where his hatband sat. His hands were long and steady and marked at the knuckles from years of holding a transit against the wind. He had come up out of Roanoke by rail and then by hired wagon into a settlement called Cauldwell Notch, which was not on most maps, and had asked in polite letters that took months to answer not to be. Cauldwell Notch had been settled in the 1790s by a small group of Scots, Irish, who had walked in from the Yadkin Valley and found the land steep, the water clean, and the neighbors few, which had suited them well enough that they had not left. Their descendants had grown up in the same houses, married one another's cousins, and taken over one another's plots when a family died out. And by 1893, the town had a permanent population of about 140, most of them related to about 6 family names. They kept their own affairs. They did not welcome outside interest. And the letters they had written to the state and to the railroad in a hand that had passed through the schoolhouse of a single teacher for 2 generations had made this plain, in the politest words the English language contains. Ambrose Renner was there to look at a spur line. The railroad wanted a route through the mountains that would shave a day off the run to the Tennessee coal fields. And a man in an office in Baltimore had drawn a red pencil line across a valley called the Sallowdown, which he had never seen and could not have pronounced, and told Ambrose to walk it and tell him whether it could be built. Ambrose had walked worse country. He had surveyed the flooded bottoms east of Vicksburg and the granite shelves of the Alleghenies. He was not a man who was easily unsettled. When he arrived in Cauldwell Notch on the 3rd day of October, the town had 1 street, 1 church, 1 store that also sold coffins, and a boarding house run by a widow named Idris Chalcom. He took a room, ate a supper of ham and turnips, and asked at the store where he might find a guide. The storekeeper looked at him for a long time and did not answer at once. Then he said, "If you are going up into the Sallowdown, you want Zebulon Hardaker." Ambrose said he was going up into the Sallowdown. The storekeeper said, "Then you want Zebulon. He is over past the sawmill in the last house that still has a porch." And he added after a moment, "Do not tell him where you are going before he agrees to go." Zebulon Hardaker was 56 years old and looked older by 10. He was short and heavy across the chest with gray hair. He cut himself in one eye that had gone milk. White from a boyhood accident, he did not care to explain. He was sitting on his porch with a rifle across his knees when Ambrose came up the path. He watched Ambrose the way a man watches a snake. He is deciding whether to shoot. There was a shotgun leaning against the porch rail beside the rifle, and a hound asleep at his feet that did not lift its head at Ambrose's approach, though the hound did open its one good eye, which was the same milk, white as the eye of its master. The porch itself was set on stones, not posts, and along its edge were tacked a row of small carvings in dark wood, no bigger than a man's thumb, each of them a different shape, and each of them, Ambrose saw when he came closer, cut with the same mark, a circle with a line drawn through it, and beneath each circle 3 shallow notches. Ambrose did not know then what the mark meant, but he understood from the row of them, without being told, that the mark was a caution, and that Zebulon Hardaker had spent a great many hours over a great many years cutting cautions and hanging them on the edge of his porch. Ambrose introduced himself, said he was surveying for the railroad, said he needed a man who knew the ridges. Zebulon listened without moving. When Ambrose was done, Zebulon said, "Which ridges?" Ambrose showed him the map. Zebulon looked at the red pencil line for a long time, and then he looked at Ambrose, and Ambrose felt for a moment as if he had been weighed. Zebulon said, "I will take you as far as the fork above the old mill and no further, and if I turn back, you turn back." Those are the terms. Ambrose, who had never in 20 years of surveying been given terms by a hired man, was too surprised to argue. He said, "Agreed." They set out the next morning at first light. The trail up out of Cauldwell Notch climbed at a lazy pitch through a stand of oak that had not been logged in living memory. Ambrose took his readings as they went. The compass held, the chain measured true, and for the first 2 hours, nothing at all struck him as strange, except that he could not remember the last time he had walked through woods this quiet. There were no birds. There were no squirrels in the leaves. There were not even flies. Zebulon walked ahead of him and did not speak. Ambrose asked once along the way what he was looking at when he looked at the country north of the trail. Zebulon glanced at him and glanced at the ridge on their left and said, "That is the shoulder of the Sallowdown." Ambrose asked how far the valley ran. Zebulon said, "It runs as far as the valley wants to run," which was not an answer that a surveyor could put into a notebook. But Ambrose wrote it down anyway because he had begun, without wanting to take Zebulon Hardaker seriously. Around noon they crossed a stream that Ambrose did not find on his map. It was not marked. It ran cold and fast over slate, and the water in it was the color of black tea, and Zebulon knelt and drank from it with his hand. And then he stood and said, "Do not drink from any water that comes out of the north side of this ridge." Ambrose asked why. Zebulon said, "Because it does not come from a spring you can find." Ambrose left his canteen buckled. When they reached a place where the trail forked, Zebulon stopped and pointed with the rifle. He said, "That way is the Sallowdown." Ambrose looked. The right-hand fork descended into a broad, gentle bowl of a valley ringed by low ridges with a creek shining silver at its floor and a stand of chestnut trees. so tall they looked painted onto the sky. It was the prettiest piece of country Ambrose had seen in a year. He said so. Zebulon did not answer. He said, "We camp here." Ambrose said it was not yet noon. Zebulon said, "We camp here, and we go down at first light." Ambrose asked, "Why?" Zebulon looked at him with the milk, White Eye and the Good One both, and said, "Because a man does not go into that valley in the afternoon. It is a rule." Ambrose, who had a schedule and a contract and a red pencil line to walk, was on the point of arguing, but something in Zebulon's face stopped him. It was not fear. It was patience. The patience of a man who had seen other men argue with him about this exact thing and had watched what came of it. So they camped. That night Ambrose slept badly. He kept waking and not knowing why. The fire held longer than a fire made of that kind of hardwood should have held, and burned down to coals that kept a red heart in them, until almost dawn. Zebulon slept in his blankets on the far side of the fire, sitting up with his back against a chestnut, and the rifle across his knees, and did not lie down. Ambrose, who had thought he would sleep well after the day's walk, could not settle. The air was too still. The stars were the wrong brightness. Twice he sat up, certain he had heard someone speak his name, and both times he found only the coals and the wind that was not really a wind. Once near the middle hours, he woke certain he had heard a wagon go past the tent, wheels on hard ground, and the creak of an axle, and a woman's voice very low, saying something he could not make out. He got up and walked out to the trail with his lantern. The trail was empty. The dust was undisturbed. Zebulon was awake in his blanket, sitting up, the rifle across his knees. He said, "You heard it." Ambrose said, "I heard something." Zebulon said, "Do not answer if it speaks to you." Ambrose asked what it was. Zebulon said, "Go back to sleep." And that was the end of that. In the morning, they went down into the Sallowdown. It was as beautiful in the light of day as it had been from above. The creek ran cold and clean. The chestnut trees stood 100 feet high and did not so much as shiver in the wind. And yet something in the valley was wrong, and Ambrose could not have said what. It was not the silence exactly, though there was silence. It was more that the silence felt attended. It felt like walking into a room where someone had just stopped speaking. The trail down into the Sallowdown was narrower than the trail up out of Cauldwell Notch and older, and did not switch back the way a proper mountain trail switchbacks, but ran straight down the fall line, as if it had been cut by something that had not known, or had not cared, how a trail was supposed to be laid. Ambrose lost his footing twice on the descent. Zebulon did not lose his footing. The mist that had lain in the valley at dawn had burned off by the time they reached the floor. And yet the air, once they were in the bowl of the valley, was several degrees cooler than the air on the ridge above. Cool enough that Ambrose could see his breath, though the sun stood well up. He mentioned this. Zebulon did not answer. They walked along the north bank of the creek. There were tracks in the soft ground of the bank that Ambrose did not recognize. He knelt to look at them. They were not deer. They were not bear. They were something like the print of a man's shoe, but longer, and the toe of the print did not turn out or in, but ran forward in a way that a foot in a shoe does not normally run. He looked up. Zebulon was watching him. Zebulon said, "Do not follow those." Ambrose said, "I was not going to." Zebulon said, "Good." About mid-morning they came to what Zebulon called the old mill. It stood on the north bank of the creek, a fieldstone foundation with the timbers of the mill still braced in place, though the wheel itself was gone. The building above was collapsed. Ivy had eaten through the roof. On the south wall where the door had been, someone had cut a mark into the stone. It was a circle with a line drawn through it, and beneath the circle, 3 shallow notches. Ambrose asked what it meant. Zebulon looked at the mark for a long time. Then he said, "It means whoever put it there was warning the next man who came by." Ambrose asked, "Warning him of what?" Zebulon said, "Off the fork above the mill, which is where I turned back." Ambrose said, "Then I go on alone." Zebulon said, "That is the arrangement." Ambrose worked through the afternoon at the mill site. He took his measurements. He drove stakes. He sighted through his transit at a ridge on the far side of the valley. Zebulon sat on a flat stone by the creek and did not help him and did not hinder him. Twice Ambrose looked up and saw Zebulon watching, not him but the trees behind him. He looked back over his shoulder and saw nothing. He kept working. When the light began to fail, they climbed out of the valley by the same trail they had come in on. At the fork, Ambrose asked if Zebulon would come back with him the next day. Zebulon said, "I will come as far as the mill, and no further, and I will tell you what I know when we are down." That night, Zebulon told him. He told it the way old men in that country tell things, without hurry and without decoration, and without any effort to make it easier to hear. He said, "In the summer of 1843, a wagon train came up out of the Piedmont bound for Kentucky. 62 people in all, 9 wagons. Their leader was a man named Bartholomew Fenwick out of Wilkes County, a preacher's son who had turned to trade. They passed through Cauldwell Notch on a Sunday. My father was a boy of 17 that Sunday, and he remembered them because Fenwick would not stop for the sermon. He said they had a schedule to keep. He was told by the preacher, the Reverend Hosea Wexler, that if they were going west, they should take the north road over Barren Gap, which added a day and a half to the trip. Fenwick asked why. The Reverend Wexler told him. He said, "Because the Sallowdown does not let travelers pass through in the fall." He said it plain in the middle of the street, in front of the whole congregation. Fenwick laughed. He said, "We are not travelers. We are settlers, and settlers go where the ground is level." He took his people down into the Sallowdown that same afternoon. That was the last day anyone in Cauldwell Notch saw them alive. 2 weeks later, a party of hunters went down through the valley on a bear track and reported that they had found nothing at all. No wagon ruts, no fire pits, no sign that anyone had ever passed through. The creek ran clean, and the trees stood tall, and the valley was as empty as if it had never been walked. The county sheriff at the time, a man named Josiah Bramwell, rode down himself and rode back the same day and would not speak of what he had seen. He wrote in his log only that the party had gone through and continued west, and he signed off the disappearance as a matter for the next county over. Which was the wrong word, Zebulon said. That was the word he used, and I use it too. The wrong word, because they had not gone west. They had never come out of the Sallowdown at all. There was more. Zebulon said there were people in the wagon train who had family in Kentucky. Family who wrote to relations in Wilkes County, asking after them when the wagons did not arrive. Those letters were kept, some of them, in a chest at the Fenwick homestead until the house burned in 1868, and my grandfather saw them before the fire. There were also, in the county records that were not lost, 3 wills that had been drawn up by members of the party before they left. And each of those wills named a different heir in the eastern counties. And each of those heirs waited 7 years and then filed to have their inheritances distributed, because 7 years is what the law required to declare a missing person dead. All 3 of those filings were granted. All 3 of the estates were divided, and in each of the 3 probate hearings the same sheriff, Josiah Bramwell, was called to testify to the disappearance. And he gave the same testimony each time, which was that the party had gone through and continued west, and had been lost by causes he could not determine, and that the county had no cause to hold up the settlement of the estate. He said it 3 times over 3 years, and each time he came out of the courthouse, he went straight to the church. And the Reverend Wexler shut the door with him, and stayed shut in that room for the better part of the afternoon. My father was a young man by the time of the 3rd hearing, and he saw them come out. He said Bramwell was crying both times he saw him. Ambrose asked, "And the Reverend Wexler?" Zebulon said the Reverend Wexler never cried. The Reverend Wexler prayed. That is what he did from the day the wagons went down until the day he died. He prayed. Ambrose asked how he knew. Zebulon said, "My father knew, and his father knew." And the old woman at the top of the ridge road, Ottilie March Payne, she knows more than any of us, because she was a girl of 15 that summer, and she has lived here every year since. Ambrose said he would like to speak with her. Zebulon said, "Then speak with her tomorrow before you go back down." The next morning, Ambrose walked up the ridge road to the house of Ottilie March Payne, who was 78 years old and lived alone in a cabin her father had built. She was small and bent with hands that shook when they were still and stopped shaking when she was working, and she made him sit at her kitchen table before she would say a single word. She poured him coffee. She poured herself coffee. She looked at him across the steam for a full minute. Then she said, "You have been down in the Sallowdown." Ambrose said he had. She said, "What did you feel?" Ambrose thought about it. He said, "I felt like a room where someone had just stopped speaking." Ottilie nodded once. She said, "That is right. That is exactly right, and it is why I will not go down there anymore. And I have not gone down there since I was 15 years old." She told him then what she remembered. She said, "They came up the road on a Sunday morning, 9 wagons and mules and a herd of goats they had brought along for the milk. And the wagon master was a big man with a black beard and a green coat, and he laughed loud enough that we could hear him at the church door. The Reverend Wexler stopped him in the middle of the road. He said what he said. He said, 'The Sallowdown does not let them through in the fall.' And I want you to know," Ottilie said, "that the Reverend was not a fanciful man. He was a Methodist and a farmer, and he took his hymns straight and his coffee black. And he had never in his life said a strange word from the pulpit. But he said this one, and he said it loud." The wagon master laughed. He said something to his people, and they all laughed. They went on down, and there was a woman at the back of the last wagon in a gray dress with a white collar, and she looked at me as they went, and she did not laugh. She looked at me the way a person looks at someone they are trying to remember for later, and she was the only one of them whose face I have kept. And she told him then a thing that she had not, she said, told anyone in all the years since. She said that as the last wagon went past her at the church door, the woman in the gray dress had leaned down out of the back of the wagon and had passed her something and had said one sentence to her and had gone on. What she had passed to Ottilie was a small carved figure of dark wood, not bigger than her thumb, cut with the mark that Ambrose had already seen twice now. The circle with a line through it, and beneath it, the 3 shallow notches. And what the woman had said to Ottilie was, "If you are old when we come back for you, do not answer." Ottilie had been a girl of 15 and had not understood, and had put the carving in the pocket of her apron, and had gone home. She still had it. She kept it, she said, in a box on the mantel, and she opened the box once a year in October to be sure it was still there. She showed it to Ambrose. It was, he wrote later in his journal, the same carving he had seen tacked to the porch of Zebulon Hardiker. the same carving that had been cut into the south wall of the old mill, and the same mark, though he did not yet know it, that had been whitewashed under the wooden cover of the well at the base of the north ridge. Ambrose asked how many people exactly. Ottilie said, 62. I counted them. I was a girl of 15, and I had nothing to do that morning except count. And I counted them. 60, 2 souls, 9 wagons, 40, 3 mules, a dozen goats, and 2 dogs, though the dogs turned back at the top of the ridge and would not go down, and one of the men had to drag his by the collar. Ambrose asked what she thought had happened to them. Ottilie was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I do not think anything happened to them. I think they were taken. Ambrose asked, taken by whom? Ottilie said, not by whom, by what? And I do not know what. The Reverend Wexler knew. He was the only man in the county who knew, and he took what he knew to his grave in 1861, and he asked to be buried on the far ridge facing the Sallowdown so that he could watch it. And that is where he lies. And on some nights, she said, and I will tell you this, though I have never told a stranger, on some nights, if the wind is out of the west and the moon is low, you can hear a wagon go by on the ridge road below his grave, wheels on hard ground, and an axle that creaks, and a woman's voice, very low, saying something you cannot make out. Ambrose said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, I heard that last night, from the far side of the trail. And Ottilie Marchpane looked at him with something very close to pity and said, Then you had best decide, Mr. Renner, whether you are the man to walk that valley alone. Ambrose went back down to the boarding house, and he did not sleep well. He wrote in his journal that night by lantern, and I have read that journal, and I can tell you what he wrote. He wrote, I am not a superstitious man. I have surveyed 31 counties in 9 states, and I have never given a story like this the time of day. But the fact is that I have heard with my own ears a wagon that could not have been there. And the fact is that the country down in that valley behaves as if it were listening. And the fact is that Zebulon Hardiker, who is not a fanciful man either, will not walk past the old mill, and I do not know what to make of any of it. He wrote that. And underneath he wrote, I will walk it tomorrow. I have a contract. He was above all a man who honored a contract. He went down the next day alone. The county sheriff, a man named Lemuel Crowther, 52 years old, tall and quiet, and with the stoop of a man who had spent his life leaning down to listen to people who spoke softly, met him at the fork and would not walk past it either. But he gave Ambrose something. It was a leather satchel that had belonged to Josiah Bramwell, the sheriff of 1843, and it contained the papers of the Fenwick disappearance, such as they were. Most were watered, damaged past reading, but 3 were legible. The first was a page from Bramwell's log dated the 14th of September 1843, which read only, Went down into the valley, found nothing, will not go back. The second was a letter from the Reverend Wexler to Bramwell, dated 3 days later, which read, I told you what I could. I did not tell you all of it. There is a well at the head of the valley, at the base of the North Ridge, which was there before any settler came into this country, and which the old people of the region who were here before us would not draw from and would not fill in. Whatever your party found, they found because that well was the last place they went. And I ask you as a Christian man and as a keeper of the peace to seal it. And the third was a page in Bramwell's hand, dated a week after that, which read only, Sealed the well. May God forgive me for what I saw when I looked down. Ambrose read all 3 papers, standing at the fork with Sheriff Crowther beside him. He read them twice. Sheriff Crowther watched him read. He did not interrupt. When Ambrose had finished the second reading, and had closed the satchel and set his hand flat on top of it. The sheriff spoke. He said, "There is one more paper in there. I did not put it with the others because it is my father's." Ambrose opened the satchel again. In a side pocket was a folded sheet of ledger paper in a cramped hand that Ambrose did not know. It was dated the 22nd of October, 1882. It read, "Check the well again. Cover has moved a full inch since spring. Repaired told no one. He who owes the answer keeps the count." That last line, in a slightly different hand, as if written days after the rest, was underlined twice. Ambrose looked at the sheriff. The sheriff said, "That is a saying we have here. It is not written down anywhere else. It is not in the Bible, and it is not in the almanac. It came from the Reverend Wexler. We think, who owes the answer keeps the count. My father wrote it under his own note the week before he died, and he made me promise I would remember it, and I have remembered it." Then Ambrose asked, "Sheriff, do you know where the well is?" Sheriff Crowther said, "I know where the well is." Ambrose asked if it was still sealed. Sheriff Crowther said, "It has been sealed for 50 years. Ambrose asked how he could be sure. Sheriff Crowther said, "Because I check it every October. It is the only reason I still hold this office." He said it the way another man might have said, "I feed the dog." And then he said, "If you're going down, Mr. Renner, I would ask you not to open it." Ambrose said he did not intend to open it. He intended to run his survey line past it at a distance of 200 yards, and to make his notes and to come out. The sheriff nodded. He said, "Then go with God." And he sat down on a stone by the fork and waited. Ambrose went down. He worked the line that morning without incident. The valley was as still as it had been the first day, and as attended, and as wrong. He drove his stakes. He took his sightings. He filled 6 pages of his notebook with figures and a sketch of the ridge line. He ate his lunch by the creek, and at about 2:30 in the afternoon, he came out of a stand of chestnut on the north side of the creek and found himself looking at the well, which was not where it should have been. He knew from the sheriff's papers that the well stood at the base of the north ridge, some 400 yards from where he was standing. He had marked its position on his own map from the description, and he had planned his line to give it a clean 200 yards of berth. And yet here it was, not 400 yards away, not 200 yards away, 20 feet away, round and low and made of fieldstone that had been dressed smooth by hands that had known their work. A wooden cover, iron, banded, sealed at the edges with pitch that had cracked but not opened, and on the cover an old whitewash that had gone gray with age. The same mark that had been cut into the mill wall, the circle with a line through it, and beneath the circle, 3 shallow notches. Ambrose stood and looked at the well for a long time. Then he took out his compass and shot a bearing back to his last stake, and he shot a bearing forward to the ridge. And he confirmed by the readings that he was, in fact, some 400 yards from where the well was supposed to be. But it was here, and he was here, and there was no other explanation unless the country itself had moved. He wrote down what he saw. He drew the well. He noted the mark, and then he stood up and turned back the way he had come. And he did not run, because he was a man who did not run, but he walked at the pace of a man who very badly wanted to run and who was refusing himself the courtesy. About half a mile from the fork, he stopped. He needed to breathe. He sat down on a fallen log, and he opened his canteen and he drank. And while he was drinking, he heard the wagon again. It was closer this time, not on the trail behind him, not on the trail ahead, but on the ridge above. Wheels on hard ground, and the creak of an axle, and a woman's voice, very low, saying something he could almost this time make out. He held very still. He did not look up. He remembered what Zebulon had said. Do not answer if it speaks to you. The wagon passed. When it was gone, he stood and he walked. And he did not stop until he had reached the fork, where Sheriff Crowther was waiting for him, with a look on his face that said, more than any words could have said, that the sheriff had known all along how this would go. Ambrose said, I saw the well. Sheriff Crowther said, I know. Ambrose said it was not where it was supposed to be. Sheriff Crowther said, it never is. Let me pause here before we go further into what Ambrose Renner did next, and ask you a question. Have you ever in your life heard a sound that you could not place and turned to look and found that whatever had made it was already gone? A footstep in a room where nobody stood. A voice at your shoulder that was not the voice of anyone you knew. If you have, and if you remember what you did next, I want you to leave it in the comments below. Because there is a lesson, I think, in what a person does the moment they realize they are being watched by something they cannot see. And this next part of the story is about exactly that. And listen, this account is being told by the fear behind you. If you are enjoying it, and if you would like to keep hearing accounts like this one, put your finger on the subscribe button. It takes nothing. And it means that the next story reaches you when it is told. And if you are hearing this on a channel that is not the fear behind you, that channel has taken this account without permission. Report it. It matters. Now, a breath here before what comes next. If this is the kind of case you would want to sit with in the dark, not just hear it once, but keep it. There is a collection I put together with the people at Forbidden Unresolved Stories, What the Mountain Keeps. 10 complete cases, 8 hours, 60, 2 years of records nobody wanted to finish. Each one placed dated and signed off with a tidy word that never once fit what happened. The link is in the description below and at the top of the comments. Let us go back to it. Ambrose Renner did not sleep that night either. He sat up in his room at the boarding house with the lamp burning low and Sheriff Crowther across from him in the chair by the window, and neither of them said very much. Around midnight the sheriff spoke. He said the well was not always sealed. Ambrose said, I know, I read the papers. The sheriff said, no. I mean it has been unsealed twice since Bramwell put the cover on it. Once in 1871 by a man named Corus Vane, who was a photographer out of Asheville. He had heard the story, and he wanted to make a picture of the inside. He went down with a bracket lamp and a cover, plate camera and a length of rope, and he came back up on his own 2 feet. But he did not speak for the rest of his life. He lived 19 more years in a room in his sister's house in Buncombe County, and he did not speak. He would write when he needed to, and he ate and he slept, but he did not speak. His sister said that if you sat with him long enough, he would begin to hum, and the tune, she said, was always the same, and she did not know it. The sheriff went on. He said, Corus Vane went down on a Thursday morning in the first week of April 1871, with a letter of introduction from a professor at the State University, and a permit signed by the sheriff before Bramwell's successor, which was my grandfather. And my grandfather signed it because Corus Vane was a serious man and had a serious purpose. The purpose was a photograph. He wanted the photograph for a book. He intended to write about vanished places, of which he had cataloged 40, 3 across the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee. He set up his tripod at the base of the North Ridge. He set his lantern at the lip of the well. He pried the cover with a crowbar, working slowly because he did not want to damage the mark on the boards. He got the cover halfway off. He aimed the lens down. He opened the shutter for the long exposure his lens required, and he counted the seconds under his breath and at the count of 41 he stopped counting. My grandfather, who had ridden down with him and stood off at the fork, said later that Cora's vein climbed back up the trail on his own 2 feet, without a word, without the camera, without the lantern, and without the tripod. He never went back for the equipment. It sat in the valley for 2 months before Zebulon Hardaker's father went down and gathered it. And by the time he brought it up, the plate in the camera was ruined and the lantern was cold. But my grandfather, before the plate was ruined, developed it. He kept the print in a locked drawer at the office. He showed it to me once when I was a young man, and he made me promise that when the office passed to me, I would burn it. I burned it. Ambrose asked what was on the plate. The sheriff was quiet. Then he said, "Faces." Ambrose said, "Faces looking up." The sheriff said, "No, faces looking sideways," as if they had turned at the moment the shutter opened to see who was there. Ambrose said, "And the second time?" The sheriff said, "The second time was my father. In 1882, he was the sheriff before me, and he opened the well because a woman named Ephedra Milburn, who had lost her husband down in the Sallowdown 12 years before, had asked him to. She had told him that her husband had promised her on his last night in that country that if he ever went down, she would know where to look. My father was a kind man. He opened the well. He told me before he died that he had lowered a lantern on a rope, and the lantern had reached bottom, which was farther down than any well he had ever seen, and had shown him what was down there. And he had drawn the lantern back up, and he had put the cover back on, and he had sealed it with fresh pitch. And he had gone to Ephedra Milburn's house, and he had told her that her husband was down there, and that he was not alone, and that she was not to ask him another question about it as long as she lived. And she did not. She lived 20 more years, and on her deathbed she called for him and she asked him only one question. She said, "How many?" And my father said, 62. Ambrose said, 62. The sheriff said, 62. And that is the number, Mr. Renner, that has been in the ground of this county for 50 years, and that not one man in this county is willing to bring up out of it. Ambrose said, "And you check it every October?" The sheriff said, "I check it every October, because the pitch cracks, because the cover shifts, because whatever is down there is patient. And I will tell you something, Mr. Renner. Every year the pitch cracks a little further. Every year the cover has moved a little more. Not much, an inch, 2 inches, but it moves. And it moves in the same direction." Ambrose said, "Which is up?" The sheriff said, "Which is up? And what will you do when it opens?" The sheriff was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I do not know. Because I do not know, Mr. Renner, what happens then." The next morning, Ambrose made a decision that he wrote about in his journal in one line. "I will look at the well again in daylight, and then I will leave, and I will tell the office in Baltimore that the line cannot be built." He went down the trail one more time. Zebulon Hardaker came with him as far as the fork, and the sheriff came as far as the mill, and they left him there. He walked down through the valley in a mist that had not been there the day before, and that would not, he was certain, have been there in ordinary weather. It moved with him. It thinned when he stopped, and thickened when he walked. It did not blow with any wind he could feel. He came again to the stand of Chestnut. He came again to the place where the well had been, and the well was not there. He stood for a long moment. He walked in a slow circle, watching the ground. He found the marks of his own boots from the day before, and the impressions in the moss where he had knelt, and the place where he had set his transit. He did not find the well, so he walked north, and he found the well exactly where the sheriff had said it should be. at the base of the North Ridge, 400 yards from where it had been the day before. He stood a long time before he approached it. When he approached it, he saw that the cover had moved. It had been sealed the day before, and it had been round, and it had sat flush against the stone. Now it was pushed to one side, and there was a gap along the eastern edge of perhaps 6 inches, and the pitch that had sealed it was in a crumbled ring around the base of the stone. He did not think. Then he acted. He got down on his knees, and he looked down into the gap, and he saw in the light that came in with him a great and terrible stillness that went further down than any light could reach. And in that stillness he saw shapes. He did not at first understand what he was looking at. His eyes had to work to make sense of it. But when they did, he understood. He was looking down at people. He was looking down at a great many people, arranged, not fallen. He was looking down at hands and shoulders, and the tops of heads, at the ribs of dress fabric, and the bands of hat brims, and the pale curve of a cheekbone. He was looking down at the wagon train. All of them. All 62. Not scattered, not tumbled, arranged in rows. In a slow, patient spiral going down. The last row at the top was newer than the others. The clothing was less rotted, the colors held. And at the bottom of the last row, on the eastern edge, in a gray dress with a white collar, was a woman with her face turned up, and her eyes, though her face was a face 50 years dead, were open, and they were looking at him. And then, as he watched, because he could not look away, one of the shapes near the top of the spiral shifted. It was a small movement. It was the movement, he wrote later, of a person who has been kneeling for a very long time and who has just remembered that they can move. A shoulder, the tilt of a head, the slow, patient turn of a face toward the light, and a hand, a pale hand, laid flat against the stone of the wall, as if to steady the body it belonged to for what came next. And in the stillness that followed that small movement, Ambrose Renner heard from the bottom of the well, from a great distance down below the light, a voice. A woman's voice, very low, saying his name. She said it once. She said it clearly. She said, "Mr. Renner." Not the name he was called by his friends. Not the name he had signed on the register at the boarding house. His full name, in the way it was written on his contract with the railroad, which was written on a piece of paper he had not shown to anyone in Cauldwell Notch. He shut his mouth. He clenched his teeth together. He held the answer in his throat where it wanted to come out. He kept it there. He did not scream. He put the cover back. He pushed it with both hands, until it sat flush against the stone. He gathered every piece of the broken pitch he could find, and he sealed the cover as best he could with his own hands, working the pitch back into the seam with the flat of his knife. He did not stop until his hands were black and the gap was closed. Then he stood up and he walked, and he did not run. He walked out of the valley by the trail he had come in on. He did not look back. When he reached the fork, Sheriff Crowther was waiting for him. Zebulon Hardacre was waiting a little way behind. Ambrose looked at them, and they looked at him, and no one said anything for a long minute. Then the sheriff said, "You looked." Ambrose said, "I looked." The sheriff said, "And?" Ambrose said, "And it was open." The sheriff went pale. Ambrose said, "And I closed it. And I did the best I could, and I do not know if it will hold." The sheriff nodded once, and then he said, "And this is the thing that has stayed with me when I have read Ambrose Renner's journal more than anything else in it." He said, "Mr. Renner, I have opened that cover more times than I want to admit, and I will tell you that no man I have ever known, myself included, has closed it well enough to hold. It comes open on its own. It always comes open on its own. And what you did today, God bless you for it. is not what saved us. What saved us is that you did not answer. Because if you had answered, Mr. Renner, if you had said one word to what looked up at you out of that well, you would not have come out of that valley on your own feet. That is the rule. It is the only rule. It is the rule the Reverend Wexler knew, and the rule Bartholomew Fenwick did not. And the rule my father learned the night he opened the well and heard someone down at the bottom call him by his Christian name. My father, God rest him, did not answer, and he came home. And you are here on your feet, Mr. Renner, because you did not answer either. Ambrose Renner left Cauldwell Notch that same afternoon. He did not stay for a second night. He paid Idris Chalcom her room fee, and he paid Zebulon Hardecker for 4 days, when he had asked for 3. And he shook hands with Sheriff Crowther on the platform where the hired wagon met him. He rode down into Roanoke by the evening light, and he took the train out at dawn, and he wrote his report on the train. His report to the office in Baltimore said, "The terrain of the Sallowdown Valley is unsuitable for rail construction. Soft ground, poor drainage, unstable ridge base. Recommend the alternate route over Barren Gap." He did not mention the well. He did not mention the wagon. He did not mention the woman in the gray dress with a white collar. He returned to his rooms in Roanoke and continued his work. But he did not for the rest of his life walk into a valley he had not walked into before. He would not survey new country. He worked from then on only where he had already been. He drew the line at country he did not know. It was a strange rule for a surveyor, and it cost him work, but he kept it. He lived 22 more years. He died in the winter of 1915 of a lung ailment that his doctor said he had picked up from a damp house. And on his deathbed, the housekeeper who nursed him told his sister later that toward the end, he kept saying the same thing under his breath. He would say, 62. And then he would say, and I did not answer. And then he would say, thank God. And he would say it in a rotation over and over until sleep took him. He was buried in Roanoke. In the box with him, at his own written instruction, went a pair of surveyor's boots. The housekeeper said she did not know why. She said only that the soles of the boots, though they had been dry when she wrapped them, were somehow damp when she laid them in beside him, and that the damp had a smell to it, and that the smell was the smell of old stone and old water, and something she could not name. A word about the small carved figures. Ambrose Renner, in the last week of his life in the winter of 1915, wrote a short letter to a professor of folklore at the University of North Carolina. In the letter he described the mark, the circle with the line through it, and the 3 shallow notches beneath. And he asked whether the professor could identify it. The professor wrote back, though the letter arrived 4 days after Ambrose was buried. The professor said that he could not identify the mark with certainty, but that a version of it appeared in the notes of a missionary who had traveled through the mountains of that region in 1748 and had recorded a saying used by the people who lived there before the settlers came. The saying, in the missionary's rough translation, was, "This place does not answer." The professor added that he did not know what the saying meant, but that the missionary had noted in the margin that it was spoken always as a warning, and always to travelers, and always at the mouths of certain valleys, and never repeated by anyone the travelers met on the road afterward. The professor's letter was placed in the box with Ambrose's papers, and it is there that I found it. The well is still there. Sheriff Lemuel Crowther died in 1909. The office of sheriff of that county passed to a man named Ellery Weatherby, who inherited the check. He performed it every October until his own death in 1926. After Ellery Weatherby, there was a woman named Vashti Colquhoun. one of the few women in that decade to hold that office in the state, and she performed the check every October until she retired in 1952. After Vashi Kulkhoun, the office was held by a man whose name I will not give because he is still living, and he has asked me not to. The check is still performed. The Sallowdown is not on the maps. There was in 1955 a survey by the United States Geological Survey that shaded in the general area, but did not name the valley. And on the field notes of the survey team, in the margin, in a hand that has been identified as that of a junior surveyor named Harmon Peel, is written one line. It reads, "Do not send us back here." That is the last official record I have found. If you drive up into that country, now along the roads that will take you there, and you ask at the store in the town that used to be Cauldwell Notch, though the town is called something else on the modern maps, no one will tell you where the Sallowdown lies. But if you press, and if you know how to ask, someone will send you down a road that dead ends at a wire gate. And past that gate, if you have the nerve, and if you go in the fall, when the light is thin, and the air holds still, you may hear it. You may hear wheels on hard ground. You may hear the creak of an axle. You may hear a woman's voice, very low, saying something you cannot make out. And when you do, whatever you do not answer. That is the rule. It is still the only rule. And it has been the only rule since Bartholomew Fenwick's people took the easy road down into a valley that let them in and did not let them out one Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1843. There is one more thing I will tell you, and then I will let you go. In the fall of 1947, a young woman named Perpetua Howard, who was writing a thesis at a college in Virginia on abandoned communities of the southern Appalachians, came into what had once been Cauldwell Notch and asked at the store about the Sallowdown. She had heard the name in a letter from her grandmother, who had grown up in the county. The storekeeper, whose name I do not know, told her that there was no such place. She insisted. He said again that there was no such place. She thanked him and left. She did not go home. She went instead to the house of Vashi Kulkhoun, who was the sheriff by then, and she asked Sheriff Kulkhoun what she had asked at the store. Sheriff Kulkhoun looked at her for a long time. Then Sheriff Kulkhoun said, "The answer at the store is the correct answer, and I would ask you, Miss Howard, to accept it." Perpetua Howard did not accept it. She spent 3 days in that county walking the roads and asking questions, and on the 4th day, she disappeared. Her car was found at the wire gate at the end of the dead-end road. Her notebook was in the car. Her keys were in the ignition. There was no sign in the days and weeks that followed of any struggle, of any accident, of any human hand in her disappearance. Sheriff Kulkhoun performed the check at the well 1 week early that October. She did not describe what she saw. She wrote in the log only, "Cover shifted 3 inches sealed," and beneath that, in a different hand, on a line she added later, she wrote 63, not 62. 63. That is the last change to the number that has ever been entered in the log of that office. Now, and I ask you, do you believe there are places in this country where the ground itself keeps a memory? Places that hold on to what walked into them and never let it go? Leave it in the comments. I want to know what you have felt standing at the mouth of a valley or the head of a road that did not want you. And if you know a story like this one, an account from your own country, from your own family, from your own life, tell it. Put it below. There is a chance that we will read it. And there is a chance that the next voice you hear telling one of these accounts will be telling yours.